Ink-a-dink, 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 ink-a-dink. Wow.
Good evening. Welcome to Basil BuddhaCat Presents. My name is David Stevenson. Basil, and I'm his co-host. And with us tonight we have, fresh off the New Hampshire primaries, heading into South Carolina, is Congressman Ron Paul. Now, Ron's going to be with us via phone. He's campaigning down in South Carolina, so he's going to be with us via phone, and we're going to probably anticipate some calls from New Hampshire and perhaps even some from South Carolina. We're going to wait while we have some calls. While we expect for the calls to come in, we're going to let Basil do a little talking, and I'll be his interpreter. As you know from the other shows we've done, that Basil needs to have an interpreter because Basil doesn't speak English. Basil speaks Catanese. And that's not Cantonese, that's Catanese. And as we've explained before, I'll explain again, Basil, when he good friend of Progressive Soup, John Kusumi, Basil immediately began getting friend requests from folks that had, for their names, had Chinese characters. And so Basil learned Catanese, that's his form of Cantonese. And so we should, okay. We have a call in. Okay. Hello, Basil BuddhaCat Presents. This is David Stevenson, Basil's host. Oh, okay, yeah. Actually, we have a very surprised caller coming in. We've got a call from Sarah Palin. I'm going to see if I can get Sarah in on the, nope, we're not able to get a voice in, so I'm going to have to do, I'll interpret for Sarah as she spoke. Sarah, what would you like to talk about? Are you interested in getting back in the race? She says she's still contemplating it because she sees that, really? Okay. She feels like Mitt Romney is, no, I can't say that on television, Sarah. Well, she says Mitt Romney is not exactly her brand of conservative. His background is quite, okay, yep, is much too scattered, much too mixed, not a real conservative. And now, Sarah, I should say Governor Palin, what would make the ideal Republican candidate? Okay, yep. She says in order to be the ideal Republican candidate, you have to be a number of things. You have to be pro-life. Now, when you say pro-life, there have been some laws put forth, some have been voted for by people in a number of states, most recently Mississippi, that define life as the moment of conception. Is that what you're looking for in terms of pro-life, in terms of your... and I'm going to take exception with you a little bit, Governor Palin, about pro-life, because I consider myself, and I'm going to ask Basil, but I think I'm speaking correctly for him too, Basil and I are both what we would describe as being pro-life, in the sense that we believe that... that people should respect life from cradle to grave, which would include taking care of people that are needy, making sure children are taken care of as far as health care goes, that they should be well fed, well educated, and have every opportunity to make it in America. Is that how you describe? She says, well, she does. She does have some level of agreement with that. However, she thinks that government should not be the one that provides those things. She feels like, she says, nonprofits, church, and things like that, churches should be the one to provide that rather than governments. Now, Governor Palin, about a century ago, we had child labor laws instituted to protect children from having to work long hours in factories as part of their family's income. We had it suggested by one of the candidates, Newt Gingrich, that children should be allowed to work, for instance, in schools and do janitorial and maintenance type of work in schools to supplement their schools, to cut back on taxes, presumably by cutting back on the employees. Now, how do you feel about that? She says she's all for that. Is there a candidate now? I mean, you've talked about the possibility of getting back in the race. Have you made have you come any closer to making a decision about getting back in the race? She says she's contemplating it, and this may actually go down to the Republican convention. Now, Governor Palin, I've also got Ron Paul here, and I've got Ron Paul via cell phone, and we're having some trouble hearing him via cell phone, or at least having the audience hear him. So I may have to step in and interpret that. Basil has something he wants to add to the conversation with you, Governor Palin. Basil feels like that even though that wolves are a little closer to dogs in terms of genetically and biologically, he feels like, I want to make sure I get this right, Basil, he feels like it's very inhumane to shoot them from planes and from helicopters, that it's hardly anything more than target practice when you come from helicopters and shoot at wolves with high-powered rifles. Well, she said she's never killed any cats, but she's thought about it once or twice, and most recently today. Okay, hold on. I'm going to get Ron Paul. Sarah, I'm going to put Governor Palin, I'm going to have to put you on hold, and I'm going to be back with you in a moment. We'll be getting other calls in, but I have your number here, and I'll give you a call back for clarification on some of the things you've said. Okay, I've got, are you there? Okay, I've got Ron Paul on the line now. Now, Ron Paul's gracious enough to have joined us via picture today, but he's beyond the line with us. He wasn't able to make it here. He's in South Carolina, actively campaigning. Congressman Paul, where do you see yourself in the race right now? Do you think you've got a strong chance to actually be a part of the process? Okay. He says he's done as well as the other candidates so far, and sure, why not? Why shouldn't he be? He says he represents a sizable chunk of the Republican Party. He says it's his core group is at least 20 or 25% of the Republican Party, which is certainly as high a percentage he thinks nationwide as the front runner Mitt Romney. Now we're going to try to get Governor Romney on the phone a little bit later in the show, or perhaps in the second show. But Congressman Paul, I was sent up by Basil. Basil sent me up to New Hampshire in the 2 days prior to the primary, and on one of those days I was able to make it up to Lake Winnipesaukee and got a chance to hear you speak. Basil and I had a conversation about that, and we're going to continue that conversation about the fact that your son Rand Paul was up there. Now Basil says he's got a lot of points of agreement with you on a lot of issues, particularly on the matter of U.S. involvement, military involvement overseas, and some other issues. I think that that you're quite accurate when you say that the war on drugs is in fact a lost war, and rather than spend resources on it, we should in fact tax drugs and control drugs that way, the same way we control alcohol and tobacco. Now, Basil and I have a little bit of a parting of ways on this. Basil and I have a somewhat of a parting of the ways on the issue of drugs. I think that drugs in fact, perhaps should be considered, continue to be illegal, and perhaps a midpoint would be to find marijuana being legalized, because it seems to have some medicinal and some beneficial effects in a lot of cases. But I'm not keen on alcohol being legal. I mean, I think if you would take alcohol out of the picture and replace it with marijuana as a legal substance, then it probably would be. Now, of course, now Basil's not Irish like I am, and I've seen firsthand what alcohol does to destroy families many times over, including problems within my own family with alcohol. Now I'm perhaps the only Irish person I know personally, or one of the few certainly, that doesn't drink. But I've seen quite a bit of damage done by alcohol, and of course also tobacco. And I think tobacco perhaps ought to be made illegal again. Ought to be made illegal, which it hasn't. Alcohol has been illegal in the past. It was one of the great experiments in the history of America, and it didn't seem to work out. But I'm willing to take a look at that again. But yes, Basil. Basil says I'm hogging the show and he needs to get his word in. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Basil. Basil says I'm gonna translate as he speaks, and try to keep up with what he's saying, and he'll correct me along the way if I misspeak. Basil says that he does, in fact, like a lot of the things that Ron Paul stands for, and the aforementioned ending the war on drugs, and the aforementioned ending the war on every country that doesn't seem to be exactly like the United States, while at the same time having commodities which are important to the United States. And I think by that he says he means oil. Very specifically put, he means oil. But he says he and I had conversations about my trip up to New Hampshire. Are you still there, Ron? Okay. Basil and I had conversations about my trip to New Hampshire and my time I spent listening to Congressman Paul speak. And Basil made clear note of the fact that Ron Paul's son Rand Paul, who's a senator, was also there. Now Basil does not like a lot of what Rand Paul stands for. In fact, he's concerned about the fact that one of his concerns about Ron Paul is the fact that he named his son Rand, which of course is named after Ayn Rand, the Russian immigrant author, whose attitude towards the poor Basil says he really feels like Ayn Rand's attitude towards the poor was basically, if they can't make it on their own, then screw them, let them die. Now, Ron, I think that's a little different than your attitudes about taking care of people and taking care of the poor among us. But I'll let you do some explaining. I'll have to translate for Ron. No, I'll have to interpret for Ron because I've got him via cell phone, but I don't have him so the audience can hear. Ron says he's proud of his son Rand. He thinks Rand obviously has some differences of opinion with him, and that's to be expected from a father and a son. But he says he believes what he believes. There's some overlapping of what he believes and what his son Rand Paul believes. There's some differences of opinion, and he's fine with that. Now, Dr. Paul, and I call you Dr. Paul, but Ron Paul was in fact a medical doctor prior to becoming a congressman, and well noted that you were a medical doctor. But then this is actually before the advent of HMOs, before HMOs came into the picture, or before they were so firmly entrenched in the picture. Now, what do you think about the role of health maintenance organizations? He says they're not perfect, but they're certainly better in his eyes than than what he describes and what the other Republicans describe as Obamacare. Now, I think it needs to be pointed out, Congressman Paul, Dr. Paul, that back in 1994, and you were in Congress then, back in 1994, when Bill Clinton was president and his wife Hillary was pushing for what came to be known as Hillary Care, that the Republican Party, the Republican members of Congress as a group, put forth an alternative to Hillary Care, or Clinton Care, if you will. And that package that the Republicans, including yourself, including at the time Speaker Newt Gingrich, put forth, was in fact almost identical to the health care plan that was passed 2 years ago under President Obama. Care to comment on that? Okay. Congressman Paul says times change, and he may have been somewhat in favor of that as an alternative back then, although, again, he does not believe that the government should interfere in free enterprise. Free enterprise should dictate its own way and run itself without government interference. But he does not like the plan that's in place now because it's got some government planning. Now, Congressman Paul, let me make a comparison between that, if I may, between health care plan that was put in place and Medicare. How do you feel in retrospect after about 40 years of Medicare? How do you feel about Medicare? Okay. He says it's poorly managed, and he feels that it's much more expensive than it needs to be. That doctors and hospitals, particularly hospitals and pharmaceuticals, charge a lot more than they should. But Dr. Paul, now this goes to the point about free enterprise, doesn't it? No, he says it's trying to mix and match government functions and corporate functions and private enterprise functions. Generally, it causes problems all the way around. Basil, yes? Okay. Hold on a second, Dr. Paul. Yes, Basil. Basil says he doesn't agree with Dr. Paul on this. In fact, Basil feels like Medicare is, although has some amount of some degree of corruption in it and overcharging, it's still in fact far better than what happens with HMOs. That HMOs, Basil's he's pointing out that HMOs tend to have an overhead. That's to say, profits and or salaries for the CEOs of the companies tend to add up to about 30 to 35% of the cost of health care. And Basil says that the federal government actually, even with some corruption, even with some theft, that Medicare is far superior in that Medicare doesn't spend money on advertising. Medicare is available to everybody that qualifies without regard to their income level. It's available to everyone. It doesn't deny people coverage as the result of a profit motive. And he feels like it's the overhead is around 3% as opposed to 30 to 35% for HMOs. Dr. Paul, would you like to comment on that? He just feels, in practical purposes, he's saying he just feels that that government should not be a part of the healthcare scene. Now, Dr. Paul, before I go back to Basil, and we have another call coming in, I believe. You talk about Medicare in difficult terms. I'm presuming that you'd be completely against a government-run, not-for-profit industry in terms of health care then. That's what's referred to generically as a single-payer health care system, which is what which is what the Obama administration wanted, but couldn't get through Congress. Yes, Basil? Yeah, Basil says that President Obama did in fact want a single-payer, not-for-profit healthcare system that would have been far superior to HMOs. But how would that have affected the status of HMOs then, Basil? Okay. Well, Basil's referring back to a time before he was around, before he was born, during the Nixon administration, when HMOs were actually brought into existence, and with the support of the Nixon administration. And prior to that, healthcare was much more affordable relative to gross domestic product, relative to income, and people got a much better quality of care. They got time. And he's speaking about vets, too, because he thinks that's the same as the case with vets, because now you're seeing HMO-type providers creeping into the veterinarian medical field where people are buying policies to cover their pets. And as a result, you run into situations where, you run into situations where corporations are making decisions based on profit and denying coverage for pets the same way that they make decisions based on profit and deny necessary procedures for human beings based on profit rather than on the needs of the individual. He says his doctor, Dr. Hampshire, has always been very good in spending time and discussing his health, not just with him, but also with Kristen, who, as the audience knows from Progressive Soup, whom Basil came along with when Basil moved in with me back in May of 2011. He says doctors need to spend more time, as they once did, with the patients and with the patient's family, talking about decisions and making decisions based on the best needs and what best serve the patients. And he says that doesn't happen now. Now, Basil, during this round of discussion about health care, there were some phrases that popped out of into existence and out of the minds of I suspect from HMOs and their supporters, something about death panels and how if the government's involved in health care, then you'd have death panels and you'd have decisions made by government employees rather than by the family. Basil says he's glad I brought that up because he actually feels like HMOs are they do have death panels and they do deny coverage and they do cause many people to die because they're not entitled to, in the eyes of the HMOs and the healthcare providers who tell the doctors what to do, essentially, that they're not entitled to things that are important to keep them alive and keep them healthy, and things like preventative medicine rather than Basil's known not only from people in his life, but also from other animals that he's known, that the majority of money spent on health care comes in the last stages of life, in which hospitals and providers tend to try to milk the most out of health care that they can to keep people and in fact keep animals. He's known of situations where animals were kept alive practically up until the time of death by artificial means, and rather than let travel through the natural course of making a decision, and individuals weren't allowed to make their own decisions about when it was time to die. Basil, you know about Dr. Jack Kevorkian, correct? Yeah, Basil says yes. He's aware of Dr. Kevorkian. He says it's a very little-known fact that Dr. Kevorkian also helped out people in helping them and their pets make that decision in terms of when it was an appropriate time to die. Okay, yep. And he thinks that should be left up to the patient themselves. It should be left up to the doctor, the primary physician, or in the case of animals, the veterinarian, and the family, and should not be dictated by anybody else. So it sounds like, Basil, it sounds like you're somewhat in favor of people being able to make those decisions and go to someone like a Dr. Kevorkian in order to control the end of their life and control when they actually go pass on into the next world. Basil, I think it's important to note that Basil, as I am, is a devout Christian. So there's a little bit of conflict in his mind about these issues, but he's also a Buddhist, and philosophically he's a Buddhist, and he thinks that there's a lot of commonality between Buddhists and Christians on the idea that that people should be allowed. Yep. Okay. Yep. Basil's thinking out loud, but he's talking about how Native Americans handled death, how they handled death as part of the circle of life, and he's quite impressed with the fact that that individuals made the decision that when they were unable to actively provide something for their community, that they should have the opportunity to make the decision that it was time to go and make that decision and not be able to not be forced by anybody to go into a situation where they were kept alive by feeding tubes. Okay, with that, we're going to actually, Ron Paul has agreed to stay on for another show, and hold on. Hello, Basil BuddhaCat presents. Oh, okay. We've got Newt Gingrich on the line. Congressman Gingrich, we're going to actually come back and do a second show. If you'll hold on, let me put you on hold. We'll take you as an early caller on our second half-hour show. And with that, this has been Basil BuddhaCat Presents. I'm David Stevenson, Basil's co-host, Basil BuddhaCat, and our guest, Ron Paul, congressman from Texas, who is in fact a libertarian. And we might spend a little time talking about libertarians in the next show and differentiating between them and more and the other types of Republicans. And this has been Basil BuddhaCat Presents, and good night. And we'll see you again soon. Thanks.
They say they'd rob your grandma blind on Wall Street, fritter her away her Medicare on Wall Street. And Pharma Oil and their pet fox don't care if she lives in a box, so long as they wear platinum jocks on Wall Street, Meow.